Being alone isn't the problem. What unsettles people is the moment there's no one left to regulate them. No mirror, no feedback, no external anesthetic. When you can be alone without feeling lonely, then you have what most people still need. Most people think their problem is loneliness, that the absence of people affects them, that the lack of connection makes them weak. But what they feel is not loneliness. It is the loss of anesthesia. It is the moment when external stimuli disappear and something remains that can no longer be regulated from the outside. When no one is there, emptiness doesn't appear. The real structure of your mind appears, and for many it is chaotic, noisy, fragmented. Not because they are defective, but because they have never been forced to stay with it long enough. Society doesn't teach you to be stable, it teaches you to be connected. The difference is subtle, but decisive. Connection implies constant flow. Responses, validation, movement, stability implies the absence of these without an internal collapse. And stability is not useful to systems that rely on your reaction. The instinct to avoid loneliness is old. There is nothing moral in it. It is purely biological. Your brain associates isolation with danger because for thousands of years, isolation meant vulnerability. Being separated from the group meant exposure, death. That reflex never disappeared. It only became more refined. Today, you no longer run from animals. You run from silence. The problem is that reflexes built for survival are not built for power. They are built for conformity, for quick re-entry into the group, for risk reduction, and those reflexes are exploited constantly. Anyone who cannot be alone without feeling small will always look for a structure larger than themselves, a group, a relationship, a cause, an authority, and they will accept that structures rules not because they are right, but because the alternative triggers their fear. This is the first form of real control, not force, not threat, but the fact that someone or something becomes necessary for your internal stability. Most people don't notice this because they experience it as normal. That's how life works. That's how relationships are. We need each other. But need is rarely neutral. Need creates hierarchy, always. If you need someone's presence to calm your mind, your position is already inferior. It doesn't matter how beautiful the relationship is. It doesn't matter how mutual it seems. External emotional regulation creates dependence, and dependence creates control, even without intention. To be alone without feeling lonely means the exact opposite of that mechanism. It means remaining coherent without external emotional support. No mirror, no feedback, no witnesses, just you. This is not a natural state, it is trained. And the first contact with it is always unpleasant. When you stay alone long enough, restlessness appears. The mind searches for stimulus. The body searches for direction. The impulse arises to check something, to speak to someone, to do anything. Not because it is necessary, but because the nervous system has been conditioned to avoid the absence of signal. This phase is critical because this is where most people give up. They interpret the discomfort as a sign that something is wrong, that they are not made for solitude, that they need others in order to function. That is the wrong conclusion. Discomfort doesn't appear because solitude is harmful. It appears because your internal mechanisms are underdeveloped, exactly like a muscle that trembles when it is no longer supported. If you stay, without correcting immediately, without distracting yourself, something different begins to happen. The noise doesn't disappear. It reorganizes. Thoughts stop appearing chaotically. They begin to repeat the same themes, the same fears, the same needs. It becomes visible how limited your emotional repertoire is. This is an uncomfortable revelation because it shows you that much of what you called authentic reaction is just programming, pattern, routine. And what is routine can be observed. What can be observed no longer has absolute control. This is where the first level of internal power appears, not control of emotion, but separation from it. Emotion appears, but it is no longer identity. It becomes an object of observation. Most people never get here because they cannot tolerate that distance. It feels cold, inhuman, meaningless. But meaning is a social construction. Stability is not. As that distance grows, your reactions begin to slow down, not because you are trying, but because the same urgency is no longer there. Emotion appears, but it no longer demands immediate resolution. Space appears, and space is everything that was missing before. Whoever has internal space cannot be rushed easily, cannot be pushed into decisions, cannot be manipulated through emotional pressure, because pressure has nowhere to latch onto. This is the fundamental difference between someone connected and someone stable. The first reacts to signals, the second can let them pass. Chosen solitude produces exactly this effect. It doesn't make you happy, it makes you hard to move. Over time, you notice that many social behaviors are avoidance mechanisms, excessive talking, explaining, constant joking, the need to be seen. All of them are attempts to reduce internal tension through the outside. When that tension is no longer intolerable, the behaviors fall away on their own. They don't have to be suppressed, they become useless. This is where your relationship to others changes, not externally, internally. You no longer enter interactions to regulate something. You no longer look to obtain peace from the outside. And this is felt immediately. People are extremely sensitive to other people's need. Even if they cannot name it, they detect it, and its absence creates discomfort because it breaks the familiar dynamic. When you no longer need, you no longer negotiate. When you no longer negotiate, you no longer yield reflexively. When you no longer yield reflexively, you become unpredictable to those who relied on your reactions. This is not a technique, it is an inevitable side effect. At this point, solitude is no longer a place of refuge. It becomes a position, an internal reference point. Wherever you are no longer dependent on context to remain coherent. This is the foundation. Without it, everything that follows is theater. Once internal stability no longer depends on the presence of others, something inevitably changes on the outside. Not because you try, not because you adopt a strategy, but because people react differently to someone who no longer needs to be regulated. Most human interactions are exchanges of tension. Someone brings restlessness, the other absorbs it or amplifies it. The rhythm is established quickly. Whoever reacts first loses position. Whoever tries to repair the tension yields the frame. These things happen constantly beneath language. When you are no longer in a hurry to resolve discomfort, you become an anomaly in that system. You don't offer the expected response. You don't enter the game immediately. You don't fill the space, and that absence produces a new tension, not in you, in others, because they are used to reaction, to feedback, to movement. When these don't appear, their nervous system starts searching for the cause, and searching for the cause is already a sign of imbalance. At first, the reactions are subtle. People talk a little more, explain more, adjust their tone, try to guess what you're thinking, not because they are interested, but because your lack of reaction knocks them out of rhythm. This is the first mirror of your internal power. Not what you say, but what you no longer give automatically. Most people interpret this effect incorrectly. They think it must be used, that it must be amplified, that it must be turned into a technique. That is a mistake. The moment you start using it actively, you lose it because you return to need, the need to control. The power we are talking about here is not exercised, it manifests. When you no longer seek to be understood immediately, people begin to assume intention. When you no longer explain, they assume depth. When you no longer react emotionally, they assume control. These assumptions are not guaranteed, but they are inevitable. Because the human mind does not tolerate a void, it fills it with interpretation. This is an old law. Whoever stays silent forces the other person to think, and thinking under pressure is rarely favorable to the one who is doing it. As this dynamic repeats, something even more interesting happens. People begin to self-regulate around you, not because you ask them to, but because they no longer receive the feedback they are used to. They reduce their excess. They become more attentive, more calculating, more cautious. This is not respect. It is orientation. And orientation creates hierarchy without being declared. Normally, hierarchy is negotiated through small conflicts, through who interrupts, who explains, who yields. When you no longer participate actively in these micro-negotiations, hierarchy settles through inertia. You don't move down, they adjust. It's important to understand something here. This adjustment doesn't automatically make you superior. It does, however, make you harder to influence. And in a system where most people are extremely emotionally influenceable, that is a massive difference. Those who built their position on your energy begin to feel threatened, not consciously, not ideologically, viscerally, because their source of regulation disappears. And when a source disappears, anxiety appears. These people will try to restore the old dynamic. They will test limits. They will provoke. They will create small emotional tensions to see if you react. Not out of malice, out of instinct. Systems always try to return to equilibrium. If you react, equilibrium returns to the old form. If you don't, a new configuration appears. This is where most people make a mistake, because non-reaction is not passivity, it is holding position. But if it is done out of resentment, out of the desire to control, out of rigidity, it is felt, and then it becomes vulnerable. Real non-reaction comes from the absence of need, not from effort. As you no longer offer automatic emotional access, relationships separate, not dramatically, naturally. Some fade, others become clearer, a few become more stable. That selection is not moral, it is structural. Those who needed you to feel good will disappear or become unstable. Those who did not need you but appreciated consistency will remain. The difference is enormous. Because the first relationships were emotional transactions, the others can function without them. At this point, a dangerous temptation appears, the temptation to identify with the position, to see yourself above, to interpret other people's adjustments as validation. This is the ego's final trap, and it destroys everything you built. Because the moment you start seeking other people's reactions as proof, you return to external regulation in another form, more refined, but just as vulnerable. The true power of chosen solitude is that you no longer need even the confirmation of that power. As this state stabilizes, you notice something even more uncomfortable. How much of human behavior is dictated by the fear of losing access? Access to people, access to groups, access to status, access to attention. When you stop fighting for access, you can no longer be controlled by its withdrawal. This is one of the oldest forms of manipulation. People comply not because they are asked, but because they fear exclusion. A person who feels complete in solitude no longer experiences exclusion as an existential threat. It can be unpleasant, it can be costly, but it is not destabilizing. And without destabilization, emotional blackmail doesn't work. This is why systems discourage real autonomy, not financial independence, not surface-level individualism, but emotional autonomy. Because an autonomous individual does not respond predictably to classic stimuli. They don't rush to belong. They don't excessively fear marginalization. They don't seek constant validation, and therefore they cannot be easily integrated into a control mechanism based on reward and social punishment. This position creates a special kind of silence, not timid silence, not defensive silence, but silence that expects nothing, that asks for nothing, that provokes nothing. It simply exists. People don't know what to do with that silence. Some interpret it as arrogance, others as depth, others as danger. The interpretation doesn't matter. The reaction matters, and the reaction is always adjustment. Over time, you notice you no longer have to impose limits. They appear implicitly, because you no longer offer space for them to be violated, not through rigidity, but through the absence of reaction to attempts. Whoever gets no response does not insist forever. Insistence is exhausting. People always look for the path with the lowest emotional cost, and you are no longer that path. This changes the entire power dynamic, not because you become dominant, but because you are no longer conveniently controllable. At this point, you start to see clearly the difference between those who want to influence you and those who can exist next to you without needing to. The difference is subtle, but constant. The first feel friction. The others do not. And here the real question appears. Not what you do with this position, but whether you can remain in it without turning it into an identity. Because the moment you define yourself through distance, through silence, through the absence of need, is the moment you create a new dependence, the dependence on being different, on being above, on being untouchable. This is the last illusion before real maturity. There is a point, after the dynamic with others changes, when attention is no longer pulled outward. Not because it no longer matters, but because it is no longer where anything essential is decided. Pressure moves elsewhere, into a space most people never explore because they cannot stay there long enough. It is the point where you realize loneliness was never about other people. It was about the absence of internal structure. And now that that structure exists, a question appears that you cannot avoid. What do you do when nothing is pulling you anymore? For most people, life is a succession of reactions, stimuli, pressures, expectations, emotions, fast decisions meant to reduce tension. When these things stop moving you automatically, a different kind of emptiness appears. Not emotional emptiness, directional emptiness. There is no longer urgency, no longer a clear impulse, no longer the need to prove. And without those primitive engines, many people feel lost because they have never been forced to decide from a neutral position. Neutrality is much harder than emotion. Emotion tells you what to do. Neutrality tells you nothing. At this point, it becomes obvious how much of your life was organized around avoiding discomfort. Choices made so you wouldn't be alone, so you wouldn't be rejected, so you wouldn't be ignored, so you wouldn't be insecure. When those fears no longer have the same force, the old structure collapses, not dramatically, quietly. This is where the final temptation appears, to go back, to reintroduce noise, to artificially create attachments, to chase intensity again. Not because you need it, but because pressurelessness feels suspicious, because purposeless quiet is uncomfortable for a mind trained in reaction. But if you stay, without filling that space, without justifying it, without explaining it, something much rarer begins to crystallize, the ability to choose without internal pressure. This is real self-mastery. Not control of impulses, but the absence of dominant impulses. When you are no longer pushed by fear or pulled by validation, your decisions become fewer, clearer, harder to influence, not because they are perfect, but because they are not rushed. Most people never have this experience because their lives are a chain of reactions to reactions, a continuous adjustment to the environment, a constant correction of position. They do not choose, they respond. When you stop responding automatically, the world begins to look different, slower, more predictable. You see other people's emotions appear, rise, and disappear without needing your involvement. You see conflicts die on their own when they are not fed. You see how much of the drama was co-created. That perspective is cold. And that is why it is stable. At this point, it becomes clear that power was never about dominating others. It was about reducing your own maneuverability, about becoming a heavy object in a system that runs on fast reaction. A heavy object does not move easily, not because it resists, but because it requires disproportionate effort. And systems avoid unnecessary effort. When you are heavy, you are no longer an attractive target. You are no longer worth pressuring, manipulating, convincing, not because you are invincible, but because the return is low. This is one of the least understood forms of power. Power through strategic unattractiveness. You are not interesting to other people's games because you do not react according to their rules. At this point, your relationship with emotion changes permanently. Emotion is no longer the enemy, nor the guide. It becomes a signal. It appears. It is recognized. It disappears. It no longer organizes behavior. It no longer demands expression. This does not mean you become cold. It means you become slow. And slow does not mean weak. It means deliberate. Deliberation is impossible in an agitated mind, impossible in a mind dependent on feedback, impossible in a mind that confuses intensity with truth. Chosen solitude removes those confusions, not through education, through exposure. After enough time, your old reactions start to feel primitive, not wrong, primitive, predictable. Like reflexes you have outgrown. You don't judge them anymore. You just don't follow them. This creates a kind of quiet that is not comforting. It is functional. It doesn't make you feel good. It makes you feel stable. Stability is rare because it does not produce attractive narratives. It cannot be displayed. It cannot be sold. It cannot be validated quickly. But it is the foundation on which all lasting positions are built. A stable person does not need to be seen constantly, does not need to be chosen repeatedly, does not need to win every interaction. They lose nothing through absence, and that is exactly what makes them different. At this point, it becomes obvious why most people still need. They need noise to confirm their existence. They need reactions to validate their direction. They need attachments to regulate their fear. And it is not their fault. It is the result of a structure that rewards reaction and punishes quiet. To be alone without feeling lonely means stepping out of that structure without attacking it, without denouncing it, without correcting it, simply by no longer participating emotionally. This is the quietest form of withdrawal and the most effective. Nothing remains to prove, nothing to explain, nothing to justify, only a presence that asks nothing of anyone. At the end, there is no triumph, there is cold clarity. A reduction of internal noise, a sense that many things that once felt urgent are now optional. Emotional reaction does not disappear, but it no longer seems important. Attachment does not disappear, but it no longer seems structural. Solitude does not disappear, but it is no longer a threat. And at that point, without ceremony and without declarations, you arrive exactly where few arrive. In a state where you are no longer easy to move, not because you are strong, but because you are no longer being pulled. This is the quiet that remains when need disappears, and it is enough.